Hello, welcome to Big Picture Monday. My name is Cali Black, here with all the context you need to totally rock this week's Come Follow Me readings. This week, we are continuing on with the Sermon on the Mount and studying Matthew chapters 6 and 7. It's actually pretty easy when it comes to context this week, so I'm hoping to keep this video a little bit shorter this week, but I still have a few things that I want to share with you that I think will help you gain a little more confidence as you're going into the readings. So the Sermon on the Mount, we talked about this last week. It's Jesus's first main discourse, his main teaching and preaching and sermon that he's giving that we have recorded, of course. And it's also the longest, and it's by far the most famous. Everyone knows the Sermon on the Mount, right? And the Sermon on the Mount is found in Matthew chapters 5 through 7. Last week we read chapter 5. This week, we're just finishing it with chapters 6 and 7. Now, last week, we also did Luke 6, right? That had the Sermon on the Plain that was like kind of the same teachings, but a little bit different context. We're done with that one. That was all that there was last week. So this week is just continuing on with the actual Sermon on the Mount as recorded in the book of Matthew. As a reminder, this sermon, Jesus refers to the scribes quite a bit. Last week I mentioned this as well, but the scribes were the Jews who were assigned to copy the scriptures. Copy the scriptures, word by word, letter by letter, space by space, over and over. Does not sound like a job that I would enjoy, but apparently they enjoyed it. But because of that, their job also evolved into being the ones who were interpreting the law when it came to legal matters, like how the scriptures would apply to legal matters, since the scriptures were very entwined with their laws and their consequences and everything in daily Jewish life. So Jesus does call out the scribes many times with the things that they are doing, about how they want everyone to see how good they are, and they're doing the right things, but on the inside, their heart's not there. And they're not even actually doing all the right things anyways. And so I love this sermon as Jesus directly kind of calls out the scribes, but he's also inviting them to be better, right? He's giving them as an example, but he's also giving us opportunities to become, and I talked about this last week, spiritually mature. The very last verse in Matthew chapter 5 from last week is be therefore perfect. And I talked about how I love the idea that it could also be spiritually mature, be spiritually mature. And so many of you resonated with that. It made my day last week to be able to see that. And I'm so glad that resonated with you. So keep that in mind as you read chapters 6 and 7 this week. Think, okay, how would maybe spiritually immature people like the scribes respond to these situations? And how might spiritually mature people respond? And how can I become that more spiritually mature person? Okay, before you start reading, I also want to give you a heads up for sure this week. Make sure you are reading the Joseph Smith translations. Joseph Smith translations are invaluable in a lot of these scriptures that we're reading in the New Testament specifically. There are some, if you're in your physical scriptures, there's some Joseph Smith translations that are in the footnotes, right? But if they're super long, sometimes there were like really long translations that don't fit in the footnotes, then they're collected in the appendix that's in the back of the book. And in my physical scriptures, I actually have a bookmark that's in the appendix of Joseph Smith translation, because it is like a pain to have to find that every time. And finally, I'm like, I should probably just put a bookmark here, so it's not a pain every single time. But read the Joseph Smith translations. They really are beautiful, most of the time small little changes that are like, oh, duh. That makes more sense. That is much more clear. And I love that. Joseph Smith just went through the Bible. He just read through it and asked God if there was anything else that needed to be changed. And so that's what we get as the Joseph Smith translation, our revelations that Joseph Smith received. As soon as he was done translating the Book of Mormon, he went right into the Bible. This is one of the first things he did as the church is being organized. And so it's so cool to be able to see some of these translations that are much more clear and make a lot more doctrinal sense as well as we're reading through them. Okay, let's talk about real quick what you're going to find in Matthew chapters 6 and 7. As I mentioned, this is continuing on with the Sermon on the Mount. So the last thing we had done in chapter 5 was we had read the Beatitudes, and then we had ended with that, be therefore perfect. And you're like, okay, here we go. but think spiritually mature. All right, in Matthew chapter 6, we talk about how to do good deeds in private, not looking for the praise of the world. And then we get the Lord's Prayer. Now, this is what's called the Lord's Prayer. I'm sure you've heard that. And if you have friends who are Catholic, you for sure know the Lord's Prayer, although lots of people of lots of different Christian religions really latch onto the Lord's Prayer. Now, what the Lord is doing is he's teaching how to pray, and he gives this prayer as an example. And there is so much truth and goodness to be found in the Lord's Prayer that can teach us how to elevate our prayers. So I love being able to study the Lord's Prayer. He teaches a lot about forgiveness, about fasting. Again, think about how all of these things you can become a little more spiritually mature. Having treasures in heaven and not having our treasures here on earth, how to serve God, and then how to seek the kingdom of God above all else. And then continuing on in Matthew chapter 7, as we finish up the sermon, Jesus is teaching not to judge, how if we ask, we will receive, because God knows what we actually need. He's going to give us all the good gifts that we actually need. There is a straight gate that we need to enter in at. Beware of false prophets. And then the last thing he teaches, if you've got primary kids, or let's be real, if you were in primary at any point, you're going to love this part, talking about the wise man and the foolish man and what they built their foundations on for when the rain came down and the floods came up, right? Make sure to sing that song this week, no matter what age you are. It just makes you smile, right? It's great. And then Jesus concludes his sermon. And at the very end of Matthew chapter 7, we get this account that the people who are listening to Jesus teach this sermon are amazed because Jesus taught as one having authority. Love it. And in fact, I'll go right into my spiritual focus question because that is it. I just imagine, right? Like there's so many great people with great intentions who have great advice. And I imagine at the time, everyone's sharing their good advice and their good intentions and what they think should be done. And it's all good. But then to have someone stand up with priesthood authority behind what they're saying and to preach, I mean, what a difference, right? What a shift for them. And then here's the parallel I'm going to draw. And I have studied this out. I've read through the church handbook many times. I love studying about priesthood power and priesthood authority. And I have learned, while I will absolutely never come close to the power and authority that Jesus spoke with, I have learned that I can speak with priesthood power and I can speak with priesthood authority. When I am leading my family along with my husband, I'm leading as a wife, as a mother, I can use my priesthood power and my priesthood authority. I can access revelation and I can speak with that assurance that what I'm saying comes from God when I've done the work to prepare that beforehand. Also in callings at church, I have the ability to speak with priesthood power and with priesthood authority in the areas that I have been delegated to. So whatever my calling may be at the time, I know that I can receive revelation and act on that revelation and speak with priesthood power and with priesthood authority. I think very often as I've studied more about priesthood power and priesthood authority, I think often we live below our means. And I'm saying that to myself as well, with being able to really access spiritual personal revelation and then to speak with that power and that testimony behind it. Once again, having that, to me, it's when I have that confirmation of the Spirit telling me that what I'm sharing, what I've prepared and what I'm sharing with my family members or class members or with my spouse comes from God. And when I know that and the Spirit confirms to me that that's true, then many times that's also conveyed to the people who are listening, and they're able to listen and feel that power and authority as well. So what I want to do is I want to reflect on those few times when I have felt that beautiful spiritual synergy where I'm like, this is it. This is speaking and acting with priesthood power and authority in my life. And reflect on how I can create more opportunities for that and kind of study more about that, because Jesus wasn't the only one who had power and who has access to priesthood power. He is able to delegate his priesthood power to us. And I love that as we make covenants and we keep covenants, we are able to access that priesthood power in our own lives. Priesthood power, the power of Jesus, the power of God. It's truly amazing. And I don't even understand the smallest percentage of it, but I love being able to study on that more. All right. Have a great time studying these last 2 chapters in the Sermon on the Mount. So many things to think about, how we can become a little more spiritually mature, and that as we do that, we can access our priesthood power and act with authority as we do what we know the Spirit is teaching us that we need to be doing at that time. Have a great week and happy studying.